Welcome back to the PB&J podcast. Jordan, great to have you back. And we have an interesting
It is good to be
conversation.
back.
Yes, it's this feels nice. It's like home. We have an interesting conversation today. We're essentially talking about trend chasing in the church, and there's a couple aspects to this that we want to look at. One is that, and this comes from things that we've noticed, things that we've been frustrated by just in general, and also our own personal experiences. How churches tend to chase after trends either in conversations, right? Well, everyone else is talking about this, let's talk about it too, and just sort of going about that, but also trends in like specific ministry practices, like how churches do church. There's a lot of trend chasing going on, and it's annoying. So why not talk about it? So is that a good way to introduce the topic? I mean,
Yeah.
I guess it's a good summary.
Yeah, no, I think
So
it's really good.
I guess we'll go ahead and get started then.
Okay. You want me to start?
Sure.
I think when we talk about this, we gotta kinda remember, like, I think we gotta frame it in a specific way what we're talking about because it's very, I don't know what the word is, like ethereal, conceptual. It's like it's not concrete.
Abstract. Yeah.
Uh, yeah, abstract, that's the word. Apparently I forgot how to talk between actually, I didn't know beforehand, but the vacation made it worse. Anyway, good to be back. Anyway,
Yep.
so, I once there was a person I worked with that was in our preaching investor program that Ben and I were in, who got advice from somebody that said that you should create every sermon based on what you read in the Bible in your newspaper. Was that you, Ben, who had that pastor give you that advice, or was
Mhm.
that Jake Gregory? Who was that?
I
You
think it
know?
was several of us because several of us had heard that before. Yeah, but I do remember saying it because it very much stuck in my mind.
It's hard to
Yep.
forget, but the idea is that, like, this is what's going on in our world, and, like, Christians need to be in the world, but not of it, right? But this is how we get in the world, by reading the news.
Mm.
Um, and we're kinda talking about that because sometimes that can get, how do I say this very not pejoratively, sticky? It can get a little sticky.
That's a
Uh,
good way to say it. Yeah.
yeah, because, like, people have different motivations, and sometimes their motivations aren't always the best.
Mm.
And as far as sermon prep goes, I would say that that's a lazy motivation, and also a very, very, very dubious proposition in general. But neither here nor there. So we wanted to kind of frame this in the kind of idea that, like, what does it mean to have a conversation? Like, what are some of the things that we're frustrated with? And at times, I think Ben and I today are probably going to be a little get off my lawn or old man yelling at cloud kind of type deals, whatever that meme is from The Simpsons, the old guy yelling at the cloud. Um, I actually
Yeah,
never
maybe
was.
a
I
little
wasn't
bit.
allowed to watch The Simpsons, so I don't know. I know the memes are funny, but I don't get the reference. So if you did watch it, you're cooler than I am. You had
Same
better
here.
better '90s than I did. Anyway, so that's kind of where we're at. We might sound a little like that because we're just going to be talking about some of the trends, and I think we're just going to try to just be a little critical of the church, but know that it comes from a genuinely good
Mhm.
place. That we want to put. I think what Ben
Yeah.
and I's intention here is, and Ben, you'll have to help me out on this one, is that we have a conviction that the church should be having that church should be functioning in X way, in a certain way, and that by doing this, that
Mhm.
you might be negating the function of the church, and also putting back whatever said topic is, by actually not actually addressing it or helping it or being constructive in that conversation. That make sense?
Yeah, like you and I, we do have that general view, which I think is why we work well together in a podcast of like, the church should be, again, in the world, not of it. The church should be relevant, but not relevant because it's trying to be trendy, but relevant because it actually tries to address the needs that are present in the surrounding community, wherever the church is, and, allowing the kingdom to be at work there. So I guess that would be a generalized shared vision that we have about the role of the church, specifically as it relates to
Yeah.
this conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, the first thing we want to talk about specifically, like, trends and, like, how churches have conversations. And I use the word
Mhm.
conversations very loosely because usually it's a sermon.
Yeah.
So, and it's what Ben just said. It's like, hey, everybody else is talking about this, so we should too. So we just went through an election cycle,
Yeah.
not to bring politics back into it. It's just an easy example. Right? This is my layup. Just taking my
Mhm.
layup. Okay. You left
Yeah.
the lane open, going in, March Madness reference for you. Took my layup. Anywho, so last year, I'm sure that we all heard after the election, no matter what denomination you're in or church you're in, or whatever your church's political leanings are, some variation of maybe our candidate didn't win, but we all need to love each other because God puts the people in charge that need to be in charge, and blah blah blah. blah. You know what I'm talking about? Like the same sermon that you hear every 4 years, no matter what, on the weekend after the election. Well, I guess this week I had to wait because of the counting, but normally the weekend after the election,
Yeah.
that one. Right. But like the idea is that it's like, hey, this is what we're talking about. We need to talk about it, even though it may not necessarily be the most relevant topic that time, because sometimes,
Mm.
at least in our before recently, it felt like some of our elections weren't quite as like significant. I'm really thinking pre-Obama per
Mhm.
se, just because of some of the other stuff that's going on. But I was younger, so maybe my perspective's wrong.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, I mean, like the reason I said pre-Obama is because like he came in during
Maybe.
like the middle of a economic collapse, so that was like a big deal. Because like, hey, how whose plan's going to fix the
Yeah.
economy? McCain, Obama? That was legit. But like, you know,
Mm.
Bush versus was it Kerry in the second one, or Gore? No, it was Gore in
Clinton.
the first one, and it was Bush versus
Gore.
Kerry in the second. Yeah, the Bush versus Kerry one, I'm not sure what the
Yeah,
way
yeah, yeah.
America was trending was like. You get what I'm saying, right? It's not significant. So like maybe
Yeah.
that Sunday it wasn't a big deal to be like an apologist to all your Democrats in your pews.
Mm.
That's all I'm saying. Anyway, I'm getting into really bad territory.
Right.
Ben, you may need to cut this. Anyway, the whole point is this, that like it just is really annoying that like you just kind of jump on the bandwagon. And what really frustrates me, what really genuinely frustrates me is that if you're going to do that, I think you need to bring, I call it a fresh perspective to the table. Ben put a quote in our notes
Mm.
about something I said to him in prep last week. So I'm going to read my quote, and I'm quoting myself, which is the most weird meta thing I've ever done. So I don't like it, but I'm going to
But you
say
said
it.
it so well. I had to
Uh,
write it down.
I don't know. This is weird. Sorry, I
Yeah.
just saw it in the notes and I was like, how do I quote myself? Like this: you can't have every conversation
Mm.
take you back to the same place. So Ben and I are
Mm.
kind of riff on this. So like for me, if you're going to have a conversation about something that is going on in our culture, so let's just think about recently Black Lives Matter, 2016, coronavirus, all that stuff. I'm not asking you to come down on your actual answer. I'm just saying, if you're going to do that, don't give some pat Sunday school answer that doesn't like really require any kind of commitment or change or move forward or progress to the actual dialogue.
Mm.
Like that's a waste of everybody. That's a waste of 20-minute, 30-minute, hour-long sermon, however long you go, or your church pastor goes. I mean, yeah, it might be encouraging at
Yeah.
times, or maybe it's nice to kind of hear it from like the Christianese perspective. But like, if you have a conversation and it takes you back to the same place you started, and you're just like, okay, we talked about it and we've checked it off the box, but nothing about my perspective or anybody's perspective for that matter has been convicted or changed, and neither of us are really trying to understand like how God would or how Jesus Christ would react in this situation. We're not trying to be him to our world. Like maybe we just wasted time.
In looking at this, I thought of something. It actually came up today. So some people might know this, some people might not. But David Platt, who was a fairly well-known pastor, YouTube videos out there, a lot of sermons that have been recorded, and he also has a book called Radical. He might have some other books. I don't really know. I've never really been a huge fan of David Platt. Not that I'm against him. I just haven't followed him that much. But apparently, he gave a sermon fairly recently, I think, about race relations. And it was really interesting because as I'm listening to it and kind of hearing some of what he's saying, I'm like, you could listen to a lecture by Ibram Kendi and hear the exact same information. Like, there's nothing unique about this at all. Like, all the stuff he's saying, like, he's not saying anything new. That's kind of like what we're talking about, where it does feel like, okay, it's just a different person, but they're saying the same thing. So, what's really the value of having this conversation? Like, it's not being contextualized, it's not really being reworked, there's no, special angle that's being taken on it. It's just, why are we doing this? I guess because everyone else is talking about it,
Well, it
so
doesn't.
we're going to talk about it too, but we're not saying anything
Yeah.
unique. I mean, it just
Yeah.
feels
No,
like,
that's the thing
yeah.
is like, no, go ahead. Go ahead. I want to hear how you're going to finish that out.
I was just going to say, it just feels like, trying to stay relevant in a conversation in like the
You're
easiest
cloud
way
chasing.
possible. Yeah.
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 You're just chasing clout. Like, yeah.
Mm.
And like having said that, I, I actually came up with this on the other side of that spectrum. Like I got really frustrated with my church in 2016 after the Trump election. At that point in my life, I was much more one side than I am now. And my wife and I were just really bothered. We had a service at our church, and like we were really concerned about like what had happened, what's going on, just some of the like the language and stuff that was happening, but we didn't really know where to land on this. And we were honestly looking to the church for legitimate guidance. Like, how do we handle this morally? Like, how are we okay with this like morally? Cause like, you know, as a candidate, Trump was fairly divisive, you know, I mean, and I don't mean that like red,
Mm.
blue. I mean that like, I mean, the guy's kind of insulting.
Yeah, even within the Republican Party, it was a bit he was a divisive figure too.
Yeah, which is why the Pence pick happened as a political choice. But like, you know what I mean? Like, so we were looking to guidance because like this is before the election or right after, and like some of us are feeling guilty about how we voted. Some of us are
Mm,
like voted third party to keep our conscience clear. But we're just like, how do I support this person even though historically he supported the values that that church particularly taught? You know, like what do we do? And like all we got
yeah.
was this like pat answer pray, and honestly a passive aggressive critique of Obama. But like the whole thing was just like, well, you didn't help me. Like you didn't tell me how to pray. You didn't
Mm,
tell me like what the hope is. Basically it was discouraging. So it took us back to the same place. And part of that was because the pastor and the leadership wasn't willing to like have the most difficult part of that conversation, which isn't talking about how bad Trump is, but it's talking about like what a real Christian leader looks like. And maybe we shouldn't be looking to politicians to be our faith
mm,
models. Go
yeah.
figure, you
Basically
know,
moving away from, like
the religious right or religious left.
moving away from that typical 4-year conversation that happens every election cycle.
Yeah,
Like,
like
can we break from that? Because we're not really in that world anymore.
yeah, exactly. And so, like, listen, if you know your congregation's full of like conservatives, which it was, you know, like, and a lot of them were worried and like they cast the ballot for him, but they felt terrible about it, even with Pence, who's from my home state, right? Like, and that was the state the church was
Mm,
in Indiana. Like, they didn't feel good. Like, offer some like guidance and wisdom. Say like, hey, like, you know, sometimes like, we have to participate in evils, and I know that you guys voted your political convictions. You know, maybe this is the right or wrong candidate. We don't know. We're gonna pray that we can have a transformative like power. Like maybe we can pray for his moral progression. Like maybe we can all admit that. You know what I mean? But like that stuff didn't happen. Instead, we're like, just pray for leaders, keep it generic, not talk about the candidates at all because we don't set anybody off. But the reality is because you don't
mm,
acknowledge any of those like things happening, like you just let it kind of go. And so then nothing changes. Nobody grows. We don't really have to have that tough convo. So it's basically kicking the can down the road. And it really bugs me. It really, really bugs me. And especially like right
mm,
now in the US, I think our generation been millennials. Like sometimes we take it a little too far, but like one thing that we're doing, I think is really good is we're trying to have tough conversations a ton, like all the time.
mm.
Like I said, a
Yeah.
little too much sometimes because I don't think our brain
Yeah.
can handle it, but we're trying to do it for good reason.
Yeah. And I think it's also fair. There is a critique against, younger generations that, "Oh, well, you just wanna have these conversations, but you wanna have these conversations that go in a particular direction." And I do see some of that. I
Yeah,
think
that's
that's a
fair.
fair critique because there is that group, that
It's
just
like
sort of
Rush
wants the
Limbaugh
clout
radio
chasing. They're
show.
like, "I want my church to talk about this conversation in this way so that my church can be, like, part of the in group or whatever. Like, we can be the
So I can
trendy
tweet
church."
about it, and then we can be the cool church that I can bring all my friends to, and they don't have to make any changes or adjust in any
Yeah.
way.
Exactly. But by and large, what I've found is people just want to at least know that they have a voice in the conversation. And I don't mean that we have to open up our
That's
churches
true.
and become like public forums. I just mean I think it is important that churches at least engage conversations in some way. Um, but it
Yeah,
seems like but the frustration is that it seems like churches are engaging relevant conversations, but they're doing so in a way that is the most accessible and the either the least challenging or the most, publicly popular positions, if I could put it that way.
yeah.
But but not
No,
really engaging it. It doesn't feel like, it's a real activity of the church that's taking place. I don't know. It just seems like either the
yeah.
church is checking off a
No,
box or they're
you're not
just looking
wrong.
for those trends.
Yeah, exactly, like, and that's what you're talking about clout chasing. So, like, you know, I really don't wanna throw them under the bus. I'm trying not to do this because I think it's actually wrong, but I'm gonna do it and forgive me. I'm gonna try not to be pejorative, but I'm just gonna try to explain it. There's a video from like the first time the BLM protests started happening in like 2016 that circulated around social media this summer with Carl Lentz when he's talking about like, hey, all lives matter because Black lives matter, or Black lives matter because all lives matter. He's like, it's not like mutually exclusive. We're just talking about how like these people are dying at a higher rate. Like, and it was like, and like politically, I was like, yeah, I actually really agree with that. I think it's really well said. I think that's a very clear articulation of the position. And if you're listening to this and you're like getting raged up by BLM, please don't miss the point. Put that to the side for a minute. Listen to what I'm talking about.
Hmm.
Based on how Carl Lentz runs his ministry and does other things in his life, I personally, even though I agreed with it, felt like it was disingenuous because one, he's at a huge New York City church. From my understanding, they're fairly undiverse. They're mostly white. They weren't really like restoring the community or doing anything to help an incredibly diverse place, New York City. You know what I mean? It's not Utah. Like it's pretty mixed. It's a different place. Like um,
Yeah.
sorry, like I don't mean to be mean. So that plays really well to your network and to your like white liberals in the city. That looks really good and it goes really cool viral and gets you a lot of book deals and a lot of speaking engagements. But like, what if you'd have done that in silence and instead of having that sermon, you'd have had like three Black ministers from churches that aren't your church, and you just did a pre-recorded interview where you didn't even have a plan where the conversation was going to go, and you were just going to say, "Hey, how can
Hmm.
we help you guys in your Black community? And then how do you think God wants us to handle racism from a different perspective? Because I'm a white guy. Maybe I look at it a little differently. I want to hear it from yours. Then maybe offer a couple counterpoints and like see if you guys can come together on stuff and just let the let it be a conversation that you listen to. Like that would be interesting. Yeah, that'd be different, a unique approach to it. I'm not saying you should
Hmm.
do that. I'm just saying like that's not clout chasing. That's like, hey, we're trying to have a conversation. Or maybe you do something like, hey, we're actually going to commit to hiring, several African American leaders in our church. And I know people really get bothered by that, but like the purpose would be like, hey, because this is a community that's actually highly populous in our area, and maybe it's kind of weird that we don't have any people that look like that in our church, even though a majority of our city looks like this. You know what I mean? Like that would be a red flag to me as a church if you're trying to serve your community and like your community is a majority one
Yeah.
way and you don't look anything like that at all. Like, you know what I mean? Like from a skin color perspective, like that's my point, or even like a demographic age perspective, right? Like we talk about it in like age, you know, point of views. Like if a church is all 60 and up in like, an urban
Hmm.
area, we nicely say that church is dying. We just say like, well, they're just really traditional, but we're basically saying, hey, that church is in trouble, like because they don't have anybody that's going to continue on as these people continue to age out of the church because they haven't been able to engage or whatever. And my whole thing is like it happens on both sides, man. Like sometimes that we just like justify positions that we already have long held beliefs on that maybe aren't tenable. You know what I mean? And then sometimes maybe we just address an issue but don't really address it in a meaningful way. Like I mean, we just talk about it, we don't
Yeah.
address it just so that we can get
Yeah.
clicks and book deals and fatten our wallets. And again, I don't want to accuse Carl
Right.
into that. Maybe he really did have his legitimate conviction about that. And I've only heard parts of that sermon, but I'm just saying, like, that would be an example. I'm just trying to use him of how maybe you could do it differently. Does that make
Right.
sense, Ben? I got to a lot of places.
Yeah. No, it's fine. I mean, yeah, that makes sense. Where it's like trying to hit the lowest common denominator for any particular topic, just so you can say, "Hey, we're talking about this, but with the least amount of effort."
That's what corporations do when they issue like little Twitter
Yeah.
statements. Yeah, that's so annoying to me. Like I'd rather them
Yeah.
just
It's like, "Hey,
not care.
we're
You know what I
trendy."
mean? Like
Right.
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, "Yeah, we're about money." Like, what of it? They'd
Right. I mean, like
probably
we know what you're trying to do. You're trying to profit and you just want to like
yeah.
say it so that we don't stop buying from you. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
you know,
So,
sorry.
yeah, so kind of building off of that point, but also something else that you said. As a lot of you know, because I've mentioned it before, I was the pastor for a few years of a small town church in very rural area. Absolutely loved it. And it was so frustrating sometimes going to like district gatherings or meeting with other pastors from the district or even the area, and it seemed like there was always these things that it's just in this, I feel like definitely repeating trend chasing. It's like one year everyone's like, "Oh, we really need to engage like urban ministry. Like that needs to be a bigger thing for the church." And I'm like, there is no urban for like 40 miles in any direction from where I live.
We have Detroit, period.
Yeah.
We have one urban church, so like
Yeah,
3.
or even, like, 2016 to, like, 2018, 2019, like, there was a lot of topic around, race relations, and so we'd go to district meetings, and that would be a big topic on the table. It was so funny to me because there was one time when we were sitting so in the Church of Nazarene, districts, large geographical areas are broken down into different zones, which are smaller geographic areas. And so we were all sitting at separate tables according to our zone. So I was with my zone pastors, and we're all from a very rural area, like farm country all the way.
Predominantly white rural, to be clear, though, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Nothing to do with like people being racist. It's just that was the culture, like very farm area, very German, white people. It is what it is. Not that we hated black people.
Eastern
It's just
Michigan in a
they just
thumb,
weren't
man.
there. Yeah. Um, we had like one black person in like a 20-mile radius for like 10 months out of the year. So the conversation on the table for one of these district meetings was race relations. Like, how are we engaging? How are we doing? Race wise, in our churches. And everyone at my table just looked at each other like, "What are we supposed to talk about?" Like, we have no other ethnicities in our communities, so why are we?
Yeah.
It felt like we were being forced to have a conversation that wasn't relevant to us, and that's just an instance of sort of what happens, in church leadership, where sometimes you feel like you're forced to have conversations and you're like, but this doesn't pertain to me. Or you feel like you're being forced to have a conversation in a certain way that just doesn't relate. So for example, going back to something that you said, one big topic of conversation that does happen in churches is you have to be engaging younger people, otherwise your church is going to die. And that was a conversation that my church had an interesting relationship with, because for decades, my church has been largely, or my church, because it currently still exists, is largely senior citizens. But that's also reflective of the whole community. Like what happens is the younger people move out, and then when they get older, a lot of times they'll retire, or just older people tend to move into this community. Yes, there are some young people there. I'm not discounting that, but it was
They
largely
retire to go to the country or
senior
whatever.
citizens. Yeah. So it's like, okay, well, this conversation doesn't, it's just different for us. So that really shaped how we approach different things. And uh, I was very fortunate because I was never really in a position where being trendy would work at all because of the demographic that I worked with. So I'm definitely going on some tangents here, but my general point is if you want to have these conversations, I think it's fine. You have to contextualize it, and let's just be honest, some of the popular conversations that are out there, they don't fit everywhere.
No, you're right. Like, I was thinking about this, and I don't know if this is a good or bad thing, but like, I think a lot. And this is just kind of like a touching point. Maybe we should not go down this road. So just stop me, Ben, and we'll pivot. But I think part of the reason that we have some of the political divide that we do is we blame it on, like, I think conservatives blame it on like coastal elites and stuff. But part of
Hmm.
it is because, like, if you don't grow up in an area where there's a lot of diversity, like it, you know, your problems don't really have to do with like race reconciliation or like how do you handle multiculturalism. So like that language is so foreign to you because it's so foreign to your lifestyle. You know, I'm not saying like, and that's in a speculation on why I think the Democrats have done a really poor job with working class whites, but that's not really what I'm getting at right now. I'm just trying to basically say that, like, how do I word this? But basically, what I'm saying is that you're right. Context matters, and I think we have to do two things, because I think the conversation is important to have, because what if there is a large migration of African Americans into Bad Axe, Michigan? Highly unlikely, theoretically possible, right? Maybe it's important for them because they might not stay there forever to like understand how to have that conversation, maybe have an idea of it. But like
Hmm.
it probably shouldn't take up 4 or 5 Sundays. Like if you're maybe in, like, I don't know, downtown Detroit, that would make a lot more sense to like
Hmm.
have like a series on it and like really expound on it. So you're right. Like when you go to these events, like I agree with that. Like maybe you shouldn't have that deep discussion, or maybe, uh they should have paired you not with rural pastors, but with people that are in different diverse areas so you could hear what they have to say and they could hear what you have to say about lifestyles and where your people are coming from. So both those ministers can communicate that to their congregation. I don't know. I'm speculating. I don't know how these events work, Ben. So maybe I'm just throwing stuff at a wall. If it doesn't stick, you just wipe it off, I guess. I don't know. But like my whole thing is like, I don't know, like there's 100 different better ways to do that, none of which are just trying to have the conversation to have it. So I hear you and I agree with you deeply. I just think that the issue is that we're having conversations to check boxes and go through the motions, but we're not doing it with the idea of
Mhm.
context and ministry in mind. And so what happens is that the actual
Yeah.
ministry of the gospel, which I think fundamentally, just by definition, right, it meets people where they're at. Like it can't happen because we're trying to make it one thing or the other. And so maybe that was a small apology for rural America and white working class people. That's not what I meant it to be. But my whole point is simply this: that context
Mhm.
matters. We have to not only like challenge ourselves to like hear other people in their context. I think that's important. I think that rural churches need to hear what it's like to live in a city to some extent, because that's a broad
Sure.
American issue. And but at the same time,
Yeah.
urban Americans need to be like, "Hey, what's it like living in the sticks? Tell me what's your problem? What do you guys go through
Yeah.
on a daily basis?" Well, no, it's actually a really big deal for us when like we
Mhm.
don't get rain because then our economic stability goes off because we can't grow. And, like that's a big deal. It seems arbitrary. Like we just get annoyed because like,
Mhm.
oh man, like now I gotta wear an umbrella because you live downtown, but like that means something. So like I
Mhm.
think those conversations need to be had, but there's a purpose to it. You know what I mean? Like we're trying to understand each other so we can work together as like a global, national, statewide, whatever group. I don't know, Ben. Am I making sense, or
Yeah.
am I arguing a strong man?
Yes, you are making sense. You gotta make it contextual. So talking about making it contextual, maybe some people listening are like, I don't know. Okay, so what does this have to do with me? Like, what does it have to do with my church? So,
Kick rocks, Ben and
which is a
Jordan.
totally fair question, and I feel like the topic of race relations is coming up a lot. That is not necessarily on purpose. I guess it's just because that's the end topic right now.
No, it's
So
one of
we're
them.
using that
Yeah,
as a pretty good example.
it's probably the most recent, impactful one that churches were open to talk about because it's not like I don't know any churches that were actively talking about the vaccine. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
I don't know. I don't want
Yeah.
to actually open that can of worms right now. I also feel more comfortable talking about race relations in the vaccine.
So talking about, maybe making this a little bit more practical to those listening, what would this look like, I guess, in your church? Like, what are the things that you're facing? Jordan, what would you say is maybe a little bit more specific of an example that some churches are facing when it comes to, maybe we need to think through how we're contextualizing some of these larger conversations.
So I'll say this, and I'm going to try to keep all names distant because I think it's important to keep a level of anonymity because you don't always know exactly everybody's intention, and sometimes that's important. So there's some churches that I know that are located almost exclusively white suburbs. I'm talking like literally like 93% white, and then like 0.85, like less than 1% African American specifically. So we're talking about race relations. It's a specific example. I'll try to give another one too, so we can have something a little more to think about. Because it's not just about this, it's about other things too. But like, this church made it as a stated goal to get more, to reach out to the African American community. That is awesome. But the reasoning seemed really odd because it wasn't because of like a legitimate conviction that this community is in need. In fact, this area in particular, this group of African Americans was like 98% church. Like they all just went to a culturally black church, like multiple culturally black churches. And so like, it's not like they're like an underserved or under, need not met community area. And like, so what are they going to do? Just like have them switch memberships? Like it, it wasn't, it was basically tokenism, right? Which is like the bad kind of diversity that we talk about. It's like the stuff that we don't think is good. It's like literally just having it to have it to say that we did our goal, but it's not because there's a real conviction there. You genuinely like have a passion to help the community. And also contextually, it doesn't make a lot of sense for either group. Like, how invasive does that feel for that one less than 1% population that's already feeling like an extreme minority that is being church? It's like being actively sought out by this group, like that's probably predominantly white based on the stats, right? Being like, come to our church. Why?
Hmm.
We need more black people. Like, whoa, like, like, no, dude, like, what is this? Get out? I'm not coming. Like, like that. That wouldn't make any sense. And I fully am aware that I'm a white dude saying that, but I'm aware of that kind of stuff. And I think that as a white person, I can critique my kind of churches that do that because that's not diversity, it's tokenism. But if you
Mm,
are in an area that is predominantly white or highly diverse and you don't have equal representation, maybe that's a red flag that you're not engaged in your community. I'm not saying that your ministry is not
mm,
good, like,
yeah.
but it's weird. It is. I think it is a weird thing though when like only one ethnic group gets served. Like I grew up at a church in a fairly diverse area. Like most of the neighborhoods around, like literally the church was in the middle of like four neighborhoods. Most of those neighborhoods were over 50%, like 60%, 70% black, right? There were three African American people at my church growing up. I can count. I know all their names. I can count them on one
Mm,
hand. Literally three. Uh, one was a part of a couple. One guy used to come on his own and then stopped coming, and the other one was someone I brought, so a friend of high school. Three. That that
mm,
that church wasn't engaged in its community. In fact, if you actually look at where most of its members came from, they actually didn't come from the surrounding area. They came from a suburb that was about 10, actually not 10, maybe like 2, 3, 4 miles out. But that wasn't the immediate area. And to me, that would
mm,
say that maybe this church's goals aren't where they need to be, you know? And I don't know, maybe that's wrong.
yeah.
Like, I don't know, I'm not a pastor. I don't know what the geographic radius is of like how far you should go. But like if you're a pastor, that would be one of the conversations I would have. Be like, when I go to start a church,
Mm,
can you give me some demographics about what my community looks like? I'd like to know where I'm living and who I'm ministering to. And I want to at least know what the broad culture is before I start getting to know my congregation specifically on top of that. Because you're trying to do two things. You're trying to be active in that
yeah.
culture, but you're also trying to shepherd your flock. I don't know. Again, Ben, that's your space, not mine. But that's an example of like tokenism.
Mm,
And that's an example of like when diversity would be needed. Context matters, right? Context matters for those things.
mm,
But it doesn't even have to be relations. And Ben, you can cut me off, but like,
yeah.
think about like churches that live in like nice white suburbs that like, we're going to go feed the homeless. We're going to drive 35 miles to the next big urban area and we're going to feed homeless there. Well, there's not even a bus that could take them to your church. So how do you expect to like, I mean, like, yeah, it's a good thing to hand them sandwiches, but you're not creating systemic change in their life.
Mm,
You know what I mean? Like you're not actually meeting them where they're at.
yeah.
Like you're not solving their socioeconomic problems.
Mhm,
Like you're just feeding them for an
right.
afternoon. Like that doesn't make any sense. Like that's not that to
Mm.
me is kind of like short-term mission work. Like it makes one person feel really good and the other person's left high and dry, like, okay, thanks for all the stuff. Guess tomorrow's gonna be a crappy day again. Like I don't know. Does that
Yeah.
make sense, Ben? Like
Yeah.
that was mean, but
Yeah, it does.
it's true. I don't know. Maybe it's not true.
Yeah. No, no, it makes sense. We're sort of transitioning into, trends in actual ministry practices. I did wanna just sort of tie off the conversation part real quick
Yeah.
by just saying, um, it's a difficult thing to deal with, and it's a frustrating thing for church members, and I totally get it, where it feels like sometimes the sermon is more motivated by what's in and what everyone else is talking about, but it doesn't feel like there's anything fresh or contextual about it. So like, and I've been in those sermons where I walk out of it and I'm like, I feel like I just watched a series of TikTok videos on the trending page, but I didn't feel like I heard anything that was actually God speaking to me. I feel like it was just everyone else's voice. And that is a danger. Like I get it
Yeah.
because even when you're a pastor, you want to talk about the things everyone else is talking about. And sometimes you can get caught in that trap of, well, I need to talk about it because this is what people are going through. But what I found really fascinating as a pastor, and I follow the lectionary for preaching. And for those who don't know, the lectionary is a series of prescribed readings for, you have like the daily office, which is for every day, but specifically like every Sunday. Like every Sunday, there are prescribed readings from the Bible. It's a very ancient tradition. It goes on a 3-year cycle. And I would follow those. And sometimes, like, I would be in my office and I would be fighting myself because there would be some big event that happened either in the community or in the States. And part of me was like, man, like, I need to talk about that because that's what people are thinking about. That's what people, are experiencing. Like, that needs to be the topic of conversation for this Sunday. But at the same time, I was looking at the scripture passages for from the lectionary for that week, and I was like, "There's no way I can integrate one into the other." And I always deferred to the lectionary, and I was like, I'm gonna preach what the lectionary passages. And I know some people would be really critical of that, but it was so surprising to me because whenever I did that, after the service, I would have people coming up to me and saying, "Thank you so much, Pastor Ben. Like, I needed to hear that today." And it had nothing to do with what was going on in the wider society or some event that happened in the community. Um, and I don't really know what my whole point in saying this is, except to say
No,
that
that's good.
uh, just like it doesn't have to be this complicated. You don't have to constantly try and fit the church into what's happening in popular culture. Like you don't have to try and make the
Yeah, you
church
don't have to cloud
relevant or
chase.
trendy. Yeah. Just let the church be the church. Like if it makes sense for your church to do
Well
something or to talk about something, then okay, go ahead and do it. But don't do it just because everyone else is.
Well, like, that's what we talked about earlier, man. The gospel is the gospel, right? It meets you where you're at. It's gonna be relevant by virtue of what it asks you to do, right?
Yeah.
And it's gonna pertain to your life, like, right? This is what we believe is the word of God, and if you believe that with a legitimate conviction, I think it's weird when we try to make the I think you're right, like, by the way, like, why are we trying to, like, jazz it up and make it something it's not? Um, and it sometimes
Yeah.
requires a lot from you, sometimes it's actually pretty palatable. Probably more of the former than the latter, but it is
Yep.
what it is. And I think what you said is really good. I mean, like, and I would even offer more than that. I would say, like, Ben, if you felt convicted, like, you need to have that conversation, but also, like, maybe you should, like, I think it would be a great, tell me if this makes sense for a pastor, Ben. This is a pitch. This is a pitch for all the people listening
Okay.
to give this idea to your church. And I want to hear your thoughts. So we need to create a segment called Bad Pitches with Jordan because I got a ton of them. Um, so here's a bad pitch with Jordan. What if you did the lectionary on Sundays and kept that as a sacred space? We're saying, hey, regardless of what's going on, we're going to put all that at the door and we're going to come and kneel at the feet of the person of Jesus Christ. And we're going to have this moment where we're going to have him bring his word, right? We're going to focus exclusively on like what
Mhm.
he might be wanting to do in our lives as individuals, as a collective church. And then beyond that, like maybe have a separate time
Yeah.
if you're having one of those social events or like a social event that happens or a current event, like, you know, for example, like historically, like 9/11, like what if you had still had your sermon for the lectionary on that Sunday, but like I think 9/11 was a Tuesday, right? It's so long ago, and my
Yeah, I think so.
hold on one second, September.
Yeah, we're looking it up right now, actually. We are such millennials.
I remember being alive,
It
but I was such a
was a
kid.
Tuesday.
Yeah, I thought so. Okay, because I remember it, like,
It
I
was a
was a kid,
Tuesday.
and it was the weirdest day of my life at school. I don't even wanna tell that story, but anyway, so, like, like, on a Tuesday, like, that happens, like, dude, if you're a pastor, like, Ben, maybe you coulda said, "Hey, I'm gonna call my whole church, and tomorrow night, even though we don't normally have a Wednesday service, we're gonna have a Wednesday get together, and I've prepared some questions, we have" you know what I mean? Like,
Mm,
you can still address those needs in different ways, maybe it doesn't have to be in the pulpit, and I think that's
yeah.
kind of what our gripe is, that it feels like
Mhm.
we're just checking boxes by like saying, "Oh, my pastor talks about that." Well, what if we just decide to handle it a little differently? We kept that space in that pulpit, which is sacred, you know, where it's supposed to be in that sacred space. And then like the church can
Mhm.
function in other routes. It doesn't function exclusively on Sundays by you bringing the word, man. I don't know, does my pitch make idea? Like you can adjust to current events, and yeah, it's a lot of work to do an event, but it's not like current events happen all the time. Unless it's 2020, but that doesn't count.
But it works against this weird phenomena that happens, within the church, and that when you say, like, as a pastor or whoever, that the church needs to be speaking to current day issues. That sounds nice, but it's a huge risk because what you end up doing is you end up dictating the entire church's focus based on what's happening in
On a
culture.
news
And that's
cycle.
that's and that's a dangerous thing. Yeah, exactly. Because you're
Yeah.
never going to have a week where people aren't talking about something. You are never going to have that moment where you can step back and say, "Okay, well, I want to preach on or as a church, we want to do something that Jesus is really calling us to do." You're never going to have that. There's always going to be something else vying for your attention. And I know this from personal experience because almost every week when I prepare my lectionary passage, I always had something, whether big or small, but there was always something there that I could preach on that would help us stay, quote unquote relevant. But you miss
Yeah.
out on so much, and one of the long-term consequences of that is you end up preaching and teaching and living out a very anemic theology, a very incomplete theology, which is something I really
Mm.
appreciate about the lectionary is because when you follow the lectionary, it goes through seasons throughout the church year. And some of those seasons, like right now, we're in the season of Lent, are very uncomfortable. And they force you to read passages and reflect on passages that you might otherwise ignore or move on or just be like, I don't really know what to do with that, so I'm going to ignore it. And I've had to
That's on next year's list. You know what I mean?
yeah, yeah, like, I've started sermons by saying, "I gotta be honest, I don't really know what to do with this passage, but I'm gonna preach on it anyways, and it's going to be uncomfortable, and I don't really know where we're gonna land, but here we are." Like, I think that is a much more genuine approach to how the church should respond to how God is working, but also in those conversations and, in those rhythms, it's a very holistic way of looking at things because there are some topics that society is just never going to touch on. Topics such as wrestling with death and mourning and grief. Those never come up in like yeah, we deal with death and stuff, but no one wants to talk about grief. No one wants to talk about mourning. No one wants to talk about, the original sin that we all have, that we are all imperfect, right? That everyone has problems, that no one is worthy. Like, no one wants to talk about that stuff, right? So, if you want to be a church that just wants to be in the popular conversation, you are going to end up ignoring those conversations and you're going to end up teaching people, again, a very anemic and sometimes very distorted theology, which is not helpful. So, that's my little
No,
tirade.
you're right. No, can I tie it together? I got something for us here that I think is good, and then we can move on. But
Yeah.
what you said was really powerful. I thought, and I think it's really true. Because here's the truth. Here's the honest to goodness truth. Life still does move forward, even with the events that feel like they should make us stop and talk about it, and it gives us something to talk about
Yeah.
and change that dialogue. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have those conversations. I think we absolutely should. In fact, I don't think we have them enough in the church world, or at least not productive ones, which is what we just talked about. But like at the same time, Ben, what you're talking about is that in addition to all that, there's still that personal stuff that goes on. Like we each have our own individual battles that we're dealing with, whether it's like grieving loss, mental health. Beyond that, like maybe it's a couple that's like on the rocks and they're really struggling, and you preach a sermon on marriage, even though like I don't know, like a big event just happened and like every other church is talking about it, but you talk about marriage, totally not related to that event
Mhm.
in any way, and you help that couple like just really figure out a way to like communicate and be healthier, and like you're the jump start that gets them to go, I don't know, to a marriage counselor, Christian marriage counselor, and they patch it up and things get better and their children's lives get, you know what I mean, like that's a story that can happen. But if you're chasing clout and you're just trying to like hit that wave, just so you can surge up on numbers, like you're missing that, I think. And so what I'm saying is that like the tie all together is that people are people. And if we believe that they're fallen and they fall short of grace, we also know that life moves forward all the time and stuff just happens. So we got to maybe make sure that we give ourselves
Mhm.
space to have those sacred moments where God can break in and address that. And then we can also, on top of that, maybe talk about those big issues when they come up. But we don't always have to like constantly
Mhm.
be responding to them. We can maybe be a little bit more proactive on seeking them out, and then we can respond when necessary. But maybe we should just like go out of that space. Does that make sense? What I'm saying? Do you think that puts a bow on it or no?
Yeah, yeah, that
Maybe.
makes sense. Yeah. I guess just as a
Had to think about
disclaimer,
it.
sort of a side note. Yeah. No, that's fine. You're right. I'm just thinking I have to do a disclaimer here. I'm not saying if your church doesn't follow the lectionary that you're bad. I
But
just use
you
that as
are.
an
I'm just kidding.
example. So,
Just kidding. Just kidding.
yeah, I'm just saying if you need some help, it's not a bad resource. Like, it's there for a reason. I'll just put it that way. Anyways, because I grew up in churches that didn't follow the lectionary, and I
Same.
thought my pastors were really good at managing those lines. So, all right. So moving on. So we already sort of
So
talked about this. We touched on it anyways. But Jordan, you're about to say something. I didn't mean to interrupt. So go ahead.
no, I was gonna transition. I'm glad you did though. But basically, we've touched on this. We talked about churches chasing trends to like get big. But let's talk about that instead of like current events or like the sexy issue to have in the pulpit. One of the things that we also want to talk about a little bit was how churches have this really bad habit of stealing ministry practices from other ones that are doing something quote unquote successful.
Yeah, whatever that means. So this is
Yeah, did I lay that
something
out?
that is it okay if I start off with a story? Yeah,
Please,
you laid it
please
out
do.
fine. Okay. So again, as some of you know, I currently lead a young adult ministry, and it has been such a huge frustration in having conversations about it because it seems like everyone has their own idea of how a young adult ministry should look and what a young adult ministry should do. So I go to various conferences at different times with youth leaders, young adult leaders, and this one time, I think it was about a year ago, I was meeting with a leader. He wasn't a young adult leader or even a youth leader, but he was hearing about what I was doing. He says, "Oh, you're working with young adult ministry." I was like, "Yeah, I'm about to start something up." And he says, "Oh, you should check out what these people down in Oklahoma are doing." And I was like, "Oh, interesting. Like, what are they doing?" He says, "Oh, well, they run like a coffee house, and they have like 400 young adults go through their doors like every week." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And I thought about it, and I was like, "That's nice, but that's not what I want to do. Like, that's not the direction I want to go. Like, I don't want to
That's
do a
also the
coffee
most
house."
offensive millennial stereotype I have heard in a long time, for the record.
Y-
I do love coffee, but you cannot get me to
yeah.
go to your church by having a coffee house de facto. Sorry. That is
No.
my get off the lawn. That is my get off the lawn moment for sure.
Yeah, no, it's fine. So there's this weird thing in young adult ministry where there's like several different models. Like, okay, you have a coffee house model, you have a hospitality model where you have a house that you sort of open up to the community, and different people can come in, like not live there, but like it's a social hub. And then you have like a campus ministry model where you do like small groups on a college campus. Like, you have all these different things, and everyone has their own idea of what they think works and what doesn't work. And it's so frustrating sometimes where people refer me to, "Oh, you should check out such and such ministry in this area." They had like, okay, recently I heard of a ministry somewhere out west, and the person told me, "Oh, like every week they have like 800 young adults like at their weekly service." And this person was, showing me videos and stuff, and like, "Oh, you should definitely check this out." Mentioned the leader of it. They said like this person really knows how to do young adult ministry. And I looked at that and I was like, "But that doesn't tell me anything." Like all this tells me is that this person knows how to get 800 young adults in a building, in a week to like their different programs. Like, but it doesn't tell me that they're actually good at, you know, providing spiritual formation and discipleship to young adults, because that's my goal. And this is just a general frustration I have when it comes to churches is churches have this really bad habit. I say this with love. They have this really bad habit of looking at other ministries and other churches that see high weekly attendance to various programs, and they think, "Oh, that church is obviously doing something good. We should figure out what it is and do the same thing," without giving any thought to, do their goals align with our goals? Is their mission the same as ours? It's just assumed that, well, they're a church, they're a ministry, so they have the same overall goal that we do. So let's just copy what they do. And it is the most frustrating thing for me to witness. And I have seen people burn through thousands, tens of thousands of dollars. I have seen churches get run down the gutter trying to just mimic what they see as successful ministry. And it's so annoying. It's so sad. And it's something that people get pressured into. Like I mentioned, like I get into arguments with people sometimes when they're like, "Oh, you should do young adult ministry this way." And I'm like, "Yeah, no, I'm not doing it that way. I'm doing it this way because this is most consistent with my goals." And they're like, "You should do it like this because this model seems to have a lot of numerical success." And I'm just like, "Yeah, screw that. I'm not doing that's not my goal." Sorry, I don't want to start getting profane or anything, but I'll just
No,
pause
no,
there.
no, no, you're good. I hear you. Yeah, no. Can I make it a little unrelevant connection, but then talk about conventional wisdom? Because I
Yes.
think that's what we're going to talk about here a little bit.
Yeah.
So it's March. I love college basketball. It's literally my favorite thing in the universe. So I'm going to make a college basketball reference. Sorry. So a couple years ago, there was a big shift in college basketball. A lot of people run something called a pack line defense. All that means is that you help so you don't have to be super athletic. So if you have a team full of slow white dudes, you can actually be competitive defensively instead of getting burned. Because in the NBA, they run something called no help middle, which forces athletic people to close out and offenses to make long, hard passes, but you got to be fast enough to recover. Some of you have no idea what I'm talking about. That's fine. But now in college, everybody runs a pack line because there's a
Like
couple
me.
programs that ran the pack line, and it takes pressure off them to recruit these high level athletes and only get athletes to run a scheme. And so now everybody runs it. And so now there's like a bajillion offensive counters for it. And like the entire like college basketball world's on its head. And there's one coach that stands out in particular at Texas Tech named Chris Beard that runs a little bit of both. And he's really, really good at both. And his team's always one of the best defensive teams in the country. Why am I talking about college basketball in churches? What I'm saying is this, that you have
I don't
one
know.
school, Virginia, that was doing the pack line, that was doing it at an elite level that allowed them to have success. They won a national title and they rebuilt an entire program. And then everybody else
Hmm.
starts doing it, and none of those schools are having that same amount of success. Why? Because it doesn't make sense. The reason Virginia did it with
Hmm.
Tony Bennett is because it
Yeah.
fit how they recruit and the players that they were getting. It made sense contextually.
Hmm.
See that word's coming up again. And then Chris Beard, who has a team that's a little bit of both, like he doesn't always get the same athletes he wants, but he's fairly athletic, can run both. So he wants to run both, and he'll just approach the matchup. While the rest of college basketball is trying to do both those things at the same time, and they're failing miserably. Why? Because they don't have the personnel. They're not like trying to come up with a solution. And so, like, conventional wisdom says when someone does something right, you do the same thing, right? Like, I mean, just think about like the millions of
Hmm.
like same products that come out after one person comes up with something really good. Literally store brand exists because of this. But like think about like the Amazon Alexa speakers, you know what I'm talking about? Like right after Alexa came out, which
Yeah.
is like Google came out with one like the Google Home or Google Assistant or whatever, and then like Apple came out with one that died like really quick. You know what I mean? But like we're just like they're just like taking the same thing. It's like the same product, and they're just like, but no, it's our brand now, so you can trust it. And that's my whole point is like that's conventional wisdom. That's how the
Yeah.
world says, hey, when something does something successful, if you want to have that same success, you do the same thing and you just try to edge them out and you just stay
Hmm.
quote unquote competitive. But that's such a business and such a cutthroat way to approach world. In what universe, Ben, does that even apply to churches in any remote way? This is not a trick question.
Uh, I have no idea. No universe that I can think of.
Exactly, because it doesn't exist. Because churches don't live in a cutthroat society. You're not competing with people. You're trying to reach people, which means as long as there's people being born, you got a chance to stay in business. So keep going. You know what I mean? Like it's
Yeah.
not like an economic proposition. Yes, there are economics to churches, but what I'm simply saying is this, man. Like when you start running it like something other than a church, you're gonna run into those same problems. And I gave that analogy about college basketball to clout chase. Sorry, I just did what I can convince everybody not to do. But then I gave one about business to be a bit more nail it home to like say, hey, like that context matters. So like maybe your church shouldn't be doing what Andy Stanley's church doesn't for a couple reasons. One, sorry guy, you're not Andy Stanley. He's really engaging, he's a really good speaker, but maybe you're good at other
Hmm.
things. Maybe you're actually a better like shepherd than Andy Stanley, which is why he's exclusively a teaching pastor. What if you're really good at like really helping heal marriages? Well, man, that's a good space to occupy. What if you happen to be in an area that has an extremely high divorce rate? Dude, that to me is a really good place. Maybe God has put you there for a reason. Maybe you should have a little bit of faith and trust. And Ben, you got to cut me off at some point here. Have a little faith and trust that you have been put in that place for a specific purpose. And instead of trying to copycat what's going on down in Charlotte, North Carolina, or Houston, Texas, or San Diego, California, you focus in on, I don't know, pick a random city, Bad Axe, Michigan, or Denver, Colorado, or New
Hmm.
York City, or wherever. Like maybe that's the place the people is. So I don't know. I get really bothered when we do stuff like that. And your story was so relevant because like this is how we should do it. It just totally neglects the reality that those ministries are successful because they figured out what works in their
Hmm.
area. Right? It's not every single one of them are generic. You know what I mean? Like, does that make sense? I don't know.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, it makes sense.
Okay.
And
Sorry. That
yeah,
was a big rant.
so I
I've
thought of
been really
another
ranty today.
example. Oh, that's okay. No, well, we're both ranty on this subject, so it makes it a good one to talk about. Although I guess it's a bit meta when we talk about chasing trends because the big trend in 2020 was everyone was starting a podcast.
Dang
But
it.
in our defense, the reason this podcast started
It
was
was for
actually
your church.
because everything was yes, it was for the young adult ministry that I was doing. and I needed a way to engage my young adults that I had lost all in-person connection with, and I was like, I'll just try this. And then, like, the same time I had that idea, I guess everyone else did too. So we aren't a result of the trend, we were just at the front of it. But I'm not gonna say we started it because we definitely didn't.
Wow. We are like many people that have a wave.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's this thing, a lot of people in West Michigan will be familiar with this, I'm sure. It was called growth tracks. I don't know if you've heard about this, Jordan. It was a huge thing on
Oh,
my
yeah.
home district. Okay, you heard about it. So there was a church in Midland, Michigan that developed this thing called growth tracks. Now, I'm sure there's other forms of it throughout the states, but they developed something that was unique to them. And they saw pretty substantial growth in their church because of it. And as a result, all the other churches on the district and even off the district were like, hey, what are you guys doing where you're seeing this amount of success and this amount of growth in your church? And they said, oh, we're doing growth tracks. And what happened was they started holding conferences, they started doing presentations at like district events and other events, explaining to people, hey, this is how we do growth tracks. So if you want to do it in your church, this is how we did it. Here's how you can do it too. And a good friend of mine, actually a good friend of ours, was on staff at that church at the time. And during one of these
Mm.
meetings, I was
I know
sitting,
this is
next to our friends. Yeah. And I said, I got to admit, like, I'm pretty frustrated with your church. And he says, and this person said, well, why is that? I said, because they're not telling people what actually made them a success, quote unquote, success as a church. I says the real success is not in the growth track. That's not the successful point. And what was happening was other churches, including the one I attended, were trying to emulate this and just failed miserably, just totally bombed. Now, yeah, there is some success with it because nothing fails 100%. You're going to have like maybe 3% success, and some people really like it, some people don't. But the whole thing I said to this friend of mine, I says the real success at that church was not the growth track. The real success was, and I even told this person, I really wish your pastor would talk about this instead, that he would talk about how he worked with the church leadership to figure out what were their strengths, what were their weaknesses, what were the needs that they saw, what were the resources that they had, and the process of coming up with growth tracks. I said that's what churches need to hear. Churches need to know, how do you work with your leadership? How do you work with what you have to meet the needs that are present in your church? That's what created the success of that church. And I says, but no one's hearing that. Instead, everyone just wants the quick fix, which is give us the product that you developed that worked for you, and we'll take it and we'll implement it in our church. And they're all failing at it because they're missing what made that church a success in the first place. And my friend, to her credit, she said, yep, I totally agree with you. So she was a bit frustrated that that was how it was unfolding too. But that's a little bit more specific of an example. But this happens all the time, right? It could be in the form of a Bible study, right? Your church needs to do this Bible study because you're going to experience these things. You need to do this Sunday school class. You need to follow this sermon series. You need to blah, 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 yada, yada, trend, trend, trend. I don't know. Like, does that really fit with the overall goal of the church? Like, what if the goal of someone's church isn't to get a bunch of new members? What if it's just to see growth in their own local community? Or what if it's just be engaged in their community, like the people that are suffering around them? Maybe they're in an impoverished area and they just want to reach out and just help other people. Like, I just get so sick and tired of people looking at these large churches and saying, well, hey, what they're doing works, so let's emulate it. And this isn't just a mega church thing. Small churches are susceptible to this too, because they want that success, right? Small churches, by and large, they don't want to be small churches. They want to be big churches. So they look at big churches and they say, how do we do that? But they don't have the resources to do it. And so they walk away defeated thinking, well, we'll never get there. And it's annoying when we sort of have this idea that success is accurately reflected in numbers and budgets. And, I really wish we could transition. And instead of looking at large churches and seeing what works for them and trying to copy that, I honestly feel like we should start looking at smaller churches and seeing what they're doing and try to emulate that, because small churches by and large have this climate of every board meeting, like every month, it's almost like a do or die. Like any new direction you take, like it could kill your church. Like you don't have these large financial resources that mega churches could have. Like you can have a large church that has like a weekly attendance of 1,000 people, you could spend like $250,000 on a project, have it totally fail, and your church is still fine, right? Or at a small church, you could spend $10,000 on a ministry project and you end up closing the doors because of it. So like small churches are actually up against the wall in a lot of cases. And so like they have to be very creative in how they do things. And part of me thinks, you know what, maybe we should listen to the smaller people a little bit more and figure out, okay, like what are they doing that works for them? Because they actually have to suffer the consequences of failure. Whereas large churches, I know I'm being critical of large churches, but I think it's fitting here. They normally don't. They don't suffer a lot of the negative consequences because they have a lot of, you know, cushion, so to speak. Go ahead and stop me because I feel like I'm rambling.
Ben, you're not rambling. Actually, Ben, one thing that you did say that I thought brought to attention, and I agree with you, by the way, just to say this out loud. I think you're right. I think that we should look at churches that we don't typically look to for success models. For
Hmm.
example, Jake Gregory's church in like St. Louis, Michigan, like is doing really unique stuff. We had him on the pod a couple pods ago. That is a shameless plug for Jake. We love Jake. We also want to plug his ministry. He's doing really cool
Yep.
stuff, and he has a big homeless population in his area in rural Michigan, and they found a way to get these guys jobs and get them skills so that they can get back from recovering addicts, right, without homes, to like long-term sustainability and being part of a community. And they even get to eat together.
Yeah.
So like that's cool stuff. Like that's solving a need that makes sense. Like that's a success model that you won't find at like, a mega church. And I'm not trying to diss on mega churches. I mean, I kind of am, but I just don't think that they should be the pinnacle or the paragon. Is that the word? Basically, when you're like the center of like the example, right? Like you're the highest
Yeah.
standard. So I pitched an idea to Ben that I
Sure.
want to pitch to you guys right now. So another Jordan's bad pitch, 2 times in one pod. You guys are lucky. I think, wow, that was really stupid. I think that we should get rid of small and large as like ways to describe churches, because we think of it
Hmm.
as such like pejorative ways. Like I even said it earlier and I didn't realize it. And I was like small church or like an aging church. You think of that and you're like, oh, they're on their way of dying. That's like so dumb. Or like the only healthy church is a growing church, so they're larger. So like if you're big, somehow by virtue of being large, you're incredibly healthy, which we've literally just seen in the news recently is not the case, right? Like Harvest Bible Chapel with like
Yeah.
McDonald, not healthy. The guy was trying to kill his wife. He hired an assassin, for goodness sake. You know what I mean? Or Bill Hybels was sexually assaulting
Hmm.
people, and he was like a big paragon of Christ community. I think it's Christ community. Or like, what's his
Yeah.
name out in Seattle or Washington or whatever. What's his name? Whatever, doesn't matter. You know his name. Anyway, that guy that was like being abusive to
Yeah.
staff, like that's not always healthy. And like people just go for the show, but then they find all this stuff about the hero that they put up on Sunday, and like all of a sudden these churches shrink pretty dramatically, or they just like hang on. Is the church truly healthy? Is it like still doing good things? You know what I mean? Or was it just built around something
Hmm.
different?
I guess because they have a large weekly attendance. Yeah, they must be healthy, right?
Yeah, they're absolutely healthy. Everything's fine. This is fine. It's like the little fire meme. Set your coffee in the flames. Totally fine. Anyway, so but like my whole thing is like maybe that success isn't size, and maybe success isn't necessarily even momentum. I think I think it's a
Hmm.
value that churches should want to grow. But what is realistic growth, right? Ben, can we talk
Hmm.
about this in prep? Can you share with me a little bit about your experience in Gagetown? Because I think this will illustrate it so well.
Yeah. So it was pretty difficult sometimes. Some of the mentality at work, because Gagetown is classified as a small church, and you know, anytime someone says small church, you're right, it sounds pejorative, or even large church. But coming from a small church, it's like that hurts a little bit because again, I mean, context matters. Yeah, Gagetown had a weekly attendance of around 30 to 50 people, which by, general metrics, you go through the list of all the churches on this side of the state. Yeah, it's not going to be ranked near the top. But one thing that doesn't come into play is the fact that yeah, we had 30 to 50 people every week, but our town only had 300. So you're looking at least 10%, oftentimes more than 10% of the entire local population. Like that's
That's
a pretty
insane.
significant like
That is
ratio when you're talking
insane.
about like the amount of people from the community that are actually a part of like
Get
what we're
some,
doing.
Stephen Furtick.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Obviously, a lot of people that came from like outside the community, like a neighboring town or whatever. But still, like everywhere we went, like people knew who we were. People knew where our church was for the most part. I mean, and like, can you really factor that in when you talk about small church and large church and like the general ideas we have about like the amount of impact a large versus small church can have? Like I've known large churches like that run like 14,000 people on a weekly basis. And then there's people who live like in a neighboring community that have never heard of it. They have no idea it's there because they live in a huge town, like a huge city. So, just looking at numbers doesn't really work. And so that was a bit discouraging for me that people looked at, yeah, that people looked at Gagetown as like a small church and they assumed like, yeah, they only do a little bit. It's like they have a lot of influence in what they do. And there was 3 churches in that town, and altogether, I mean, they made up, oh, geez, you could say half the town at 40% of the town, like at 10. So yeah, like there's a lot of interesting
Wow.
dynamics and stuff that's going on there. But I wanted to touch on something. I don't want to get ahead if you were going to try to make a point. So I'll just pause for a
No,
second.
no,
But
no, 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 no.
um,
No, do it, do it. Go. I'm loving where this is going. I wanna go with you.
I had another example. This isn't from Gagetown. It's actually referencing that ministry I mentioned before, sort of. So when I was getting ready for young adult ministry, again, people were giving me examples. There was a ministry that was often cited to me. It was kind of a hospitality model. They had a weekly breakfast. I think it was every week. They did a breakfast on Mondays or something. And they had like, I don't know, hundreds of students from the neighboring college come and like be in that space one time a week. They'd get breakfast. They do a little devotional or something, invite them to small group essentially. And a lot of people looked at that and said, wow, look at that. They're getting 200 students a week or 300, maybe 400. I don't know. We'll say 300, happy medium. They're getting 300 students a week. Like they must be doing something really, really, really well. And the last thing I heard of that ministry, they actually stopped doing their breakfast. And they said, you know what? Yeah, we're getting 300 students a week, but our goal isn't just to get people in the doors. Our goal is to see like spiritual development and growth. And the way that we really do that is through our small groups and our discipleship ministries. And we're not seeing any turnover from our weekly breakfast into those small groups. So we're just going to nix it. Like, why are we spending all this time and all this money and all this resources for something? And the only positive thing we can say about it is look at our weekly numbers. And so they says, no, like that's not our vision. That's not our goal. So we're going to scrap that. We're going to focus on the thing that we're really about. And that I think is a perfect image of what really should be the models that we try to emulate in our churches, which is saying no to the things that, yeah, might look good, like in the bottom line, but really don't fit with the vision of what the church is actually trying to do. And even going so far as to say, we're going to make decisions that are going to end up leading to less numbers because our goal lies somewhere else. And so I definitely applaud that decision that was made because I'm sure there was a lot of kickback. Like I'm sure there's probably some phone calls like, "Hey, I saw your weekly attendance like really dropped by like a few hundred people. Like, what's going on? Like this does not look good." Like because there's a lot of pressure. Like when you start showing that growth, like you want to keep showing it because people are impressed and people want you to come share at where they're at. Like, "Oh, tell us what's going on." When they see your numbers drop, people aren't that interested. So you sort of lose that clout. But that, yeah, like it becomes a
It's not
matter
about
of,
clout though.
yeah, it becomes a matter of defining what is the role of ministry. And you don't see that accurately reflected in whether a church has, a weekly attendance of 30 to 50 or whether a church has a weekly attendance of like 5,000. That's not, yeah. So I'm totally with you. Like the whole small versus large church thing, it's really a bad descriptor um, of
Yeah,
what
we
a
should
church
just say
is.
church.
Yeah.
Like, just if you have to designate it by a location, I guess, to be simple. But, like, I don't know, I think that's really hard for people to hear because like, it's such a common thing,
Mhm.
like, people are like, "Oh, look at the life cycle of a church," right? Like, you peak and then you just shrink, and I'm like, I mean, maybe, like, who does that apply to? What's the sample size? What kind of churches were you studying? Where were they located? You know what I mean? Like, there's so many, like, factors into that. It's just
Mhm.
hard to believe that kind of stuff. I don't know if you've seen those church life cycle books and
Yeah.
stuff, but I don't know, man. I
Yeah.
just
Oh, like we had some people come to one of our district conferences and they pitched that idea of the whole church life cycle thing. And I remember being a bit critical of that and I was thinking of it and I was like, but just because, okay, let's say your church is really focused on discipleship and really focused on preaching, that doesn't always translate into numbers. It just doesn't. It just doesn't. I mean, Jesus discipled with, his 12 followers for 3 years, and at the end of it, he didn't even have all 12 anymore. Like, we'd call that a failure, right? So,
He lost one. It's kind of intense. That last one was of an intense situation.
yeah.
No, you're not wrong. I That's interesting actually to think of it that way. I used to have a guy I traveled with. Jeremiah said this, and I don't know how. Maybe it's relevant, maybe it's not. So ignore it if it's not. But he said that at one point in John, Jesus had 5,000 followers. He feeds them all,
Mhm.
then tells them a hard truth, and they literally all leave, and he goes back down to 12. And
Yeah.
I was like, huh, that's really interesting. And
Yeah, pretty much.
yeah, it's kind of a funny way to like talk about priorities and like what's healthy and what's not.
Mhm.
So I think it illustrates that point in a humorous way. But yeah, I think that's really good, Ben. I was thinking about what you had to say, and I just really respect it. Um, Man, I don't even know. Like I know what I want to say, I just don't know how to get it out. Okay, so we've been saying this all pod. Context matters. You know what I mean? Like it's a big deal
Mhm.
for like our churches. And when you were talking, I was thinking about like your church success in general, and like just like how a lot of times this is what I was going to say. If you buy into that mindset and your church is failing, to live up to a standard that's arbitrary to begin with and probably not even healthy, but like growing
Mhm.
is the only way to go. And if you're not going up, you're not going at all. Like that kind of like boomer bust type deal. Like how discouraging is that? For one,
Yeah.
you as a leader, you're putting yourself up for failure. And two, like your church body, like you're not even helping them be edified. Cause like for that, like in that sense, you're almost putting pressure on them and saying they're failing as a church, which they may not actually be. They're just
Mhm.
not growing, and there's a lot of factors why it could not be growing,
Yeah.
there are realistic
Yeah.
situations where people just don't want to do the outreach and they're stubborn, and that happens. That's a scenario that does occur. Part of me wonders though, maybe that's not as common as we think. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I mean, no, I agree. Because I know in Gagetown, like, we did several things to reach out to the community, and I cannot remember a single time it translated into anyone actually attending our weekly service. Like, outside of, maybe Mother's Day or Easter, which were like the big moments like in the year. But other than that, like we held an after school program for a local school for a short while. We reached out to different businesses and stuff in our community. We had like community events. We had a youth group that came by and did like work projects in the community. Like we really tried to just love on our community. Like that was our big thing. But it never translated into any change in our Sunday school numbers or our weekly service numbers. And so like and so it makes it tough to be like, okay, why are we actually doing this? Are we doing this just to be the church? Or are we doing this because we want numbers out of it? And so I tried to make it intentional that whenever I pitched a new idea, I said, if our numbers do not increase at all, if we have no change, or even if we decrease in number, like, is it still worth doing this thing? And if the answer is yes, then we're doing it for the right reason. That was sort of my take on it.
Did you ask your board when you did that? Like, did you just pitch that to your board? I'm just curious, like how you did that as like a
I
administrator.
yeah, I told it to the board. I says, "This is my position with this thing." It came from, I think it was the time when I wanted. I don't know if it was my idea or the board's idea. I'll say it was the board's idea. I don't want to take credit for it if it wasn't. Um, of reaching out to the community businesses and just sharing our appreciation with them and like sort of investing, time and even resources to sort of help them out. I says,
That's
even
cool.
if no one ever comes to the church as a result of this, like this is what we need to do. Like this is what we need
You've
to do as a
communicated
church.
God's love to the community. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was our goal. And so it didn't matter if we had numbers or not. And but it was still defeating a little bit because it's encouraging to see like, oh, so and so from this business has
Most
started coming to
tangible.
our church as a result of that, right? Like that looks like success to a lot of people, and it's very tempting to say that's what success looks like. Like even thinking about it, like, yeah, it's tough to not think that way. It's really really difficult. So you like have to intentionally work against that mentality, and it's not easy. So I know we've been really critical of churches and like church leaders, but like I get it. I'm sure Jordan does too. I don't want to speak for you, but like yeah, it's tough. It's tough to not think that way. because you want to you success is when it comes to ministry, it's so easy to think of it as a certain thing, which is numerical growth, which leads you to end up being a trend chaser because you see other people have that result. So I don't know. I'm about to
Yeah,
start
you're not
rambling.
wrong. Do you No, do you think that we should maybe avoid the phrase success when talking about churches, and we should talk about, like, maybe mission or
Yeah.
purpose or something that's not as easy to define? Because maybe we shouldn't be talking about it in, like, concrete terms anyway, because it's not a concrete thing. I don't know.
Yeah. I have a love-hate relationship with the word success, especially when it comes to ministry, because every time I use it, I feel like it's a really bad use of the word. So thank you.
Alright, I've pitched 3 times today and I got 1 buy. This is good. I don't know, man. I just like we've talked about this before. I just feel like that business culture and that like treat it like a business, run it like a business, like culture has like permeated in churches, and it's just really like that can work for some to some extent. To what extent that's healthy and good, I don't know, but we really bought into this like we were making jokes in pre-show. I'll just kind of share a little bit of it. Like, isn't that just the American dream though to like come up with a product or like a fix all and then like have it succeed for you and then sell it to everybody else as the form of success. They all buy it. And then you tell them when it doesn't work for them, you say, well, you just got to try harder and buy more of my stuff. And they keep coming back. It's like literally the self-help guru playbook. But like, you see that and you're like, all right. He's like, I read a book a day. And it's like, well, first of all, those are some of the easiest, simplest, not challenging books ever. Sorry
Yeah.
to business literature. It's helpful stuff. Some of it's helpful. I work in a Fortune 500 company. Some of that stuff we pass around. But like, it's not like you're reading like the Brothers Karamazov in a day. Like you're not reading something that's like challenging to your spirit. You're just like, here's how to run a healthy organization. Based on my experiences being a CEO. I also have a Penn degree, and my parents were
Yeah.
alumni of Harvard and Princeton. Like, oh, I wonder how you got that job. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that sounds so mean. I'm being so
Yeah.
critical, but like that, like why is that even a cultural thing for churches? Like, why is that even like in our scope that we're like, oh, well, I'll buy the product of this church that this leader is selling me and it's going to fix all my problems? Like, I think that we just got to
Mm.
get some, like, I don't know, what's the word, chutzpah, like some fortitude, like be creative. Like,
Some
God has
chutzpah.
placed you there, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always feel weird using that word. Isn't that like kind of like a Yiddish phrase? I don't know.
I think so. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. I'm very ignorant of
Some
the
gufting.
origin of the etymology of the word chutzpah. Some gumption. There we go for my southern friends.
Yeah.
Some gumption. I can't say it with a southern accent because I don't got one. But my
Yeah.
whole thing is my whole thing is like, what if we just tried to get creative and trusted that God has put us there and that maybe He'll provide some of those answers? Maybe that the power of the Holy Spirit and the working of the Holy Spirit will illuminate our paths in some ways. Maybe I don't know. What do you think Jesus is talking about when He's talking about He's prepared a table for you? I don't know. I mean, that's probably a bad. Actually, that's a bad exegesis. But my whole point is simply this: that like we can still have faith that God can work, and I think that we should do that, and maybe not try to like buy a solution. That's like the most uncool American thing you can do is try to buy the fix all to your problems. Like, we don't need to have like a big mass marketing
Yeah.
church type deal. I'm sorry. That's my rant. That's my get off. That's my second get off my lawn thing for tonight.
So for those who heard the podcast that Jake Gregory and I did, Pastor Jake, this was sort of a theme that we ended up on, which is, I think it works here too, which is, don't feel pressured to look or sound like, someone else, right? So just because you see other churches doing something, that doesn't mean you have to do it. Like, just do what works for you. And I know that's a challenge to try and figure out, well, who are you as a church? What is your vision? What is your goal? Do what fits within that. You don't have to mimic other churches. Like, do your own thing. And if doing your own thing means you have a weekly attendance of 25 people and every week, year on end, like, as long as you're not working against what God wants to do in your community, like, that's totally fine. Like, sometimes, like, we need churches like that. Like, we need churches who are just like, we're going to stay the course. We're going to do this. We're going to do the hard work of just weekly giving our lives to God. And sometimes, like I mentioned before, that doesn't translate into growing numbers, because, growth in discipleship and growth in spiritual formation, it's just you just can't, it's not something you can just measure. And so looking at measurement success is a really bad metric
Yeah.
for ministry.
Results-based ministry, I think, is a dubious proposition. That's my
Yes.
summary. All right.
I
Well, to
like that.
cap it all off, we'll say what we've been saying this whole time. Context matters. Make sure that you look at what's going on around you. Know if you're a church leader and you're listening to this, know your people, know your community, know what God has put on your heart. And those are all three really hard things to do. That I think
Yeah.
that's probably the toughest job of being a pastor. That's why I'm not one. One of the many reasons
Mhm.
why I'm not one. Penn's
Yeah.
like, yeah, it's really tough. But like, like definitely do those things. Cause I think that what we'll find is if we're as faithful, if we are faithful, God will start moving, and it may not look what we think is traditionally success, but I guarantee you'll know it when it happens. I really mean that. I really believe that. I don't know, Ben. Do you feel that way?
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Um, so thank you, Jordan, for saying that. And thank you all for listening to this episode. If you liked it, leave a like. If you have anything you want to say, maybe share some experiences or some reflections, or even if you disagree with us, leave a comment or reach out to us through email or social media. All those links are down below. And be sure to share this. It really helps us out, helps get the word out. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.